Clara clutched the thin portfolio against her chest, the paper cool and flimsy against the frantic beating of her heart. It felt like a shield, the only thing protecting her from the oppressive opulence of her mother-in-law's dining room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck, a combination that made her stomach churn with anxiety. Every clink of silverware against porcelain sounded like a judgment, every burst of laughter a thinly veiled jab at her expense. This was Laura's kingdom, and Clara was merely a court jester, permitted to exist as long as she was amusingly pathetic. Her husband, Ethan, sat beside her, a handsome but hollow man sculpted from his mother's expectations. He hadn't looked at her, not really, since they arrived. His attention was a satellite orbiting Laura, the gravitational center of his world. He would laugh when she laughed, nod when she spoke, his spine a pliant reed, bending to her will. He was her creation, and Clara was the unfortunate blemish on his otherwise perfect, curated life. "Ethan, darling, do tell Veronica about the new acquisition," Laura commanded, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. Her diamonds glittered cruelly under the chandelier's light, tiny, cold stars in a universe of her own making. She didn't look at Clara, but Clara felt the words were for her, a reminder of the world of high finance and ruthless success she would never understand. Ethan puffed out his chest, launching into a rehearsed monologue about leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers. The words were meaningless to Clara. All she heard was the distance growing between them, a chasm carved out by money and ambition. Her own dream, the one tucked away in the portfolio, felt smaller and more foolish with every syllable he uttered. It was a dream of flour and sugar, of warm bread and simple kindness, a currency that held no value in this house. The dinner dragged on, a slow-motion performance of social warfare. Laura held court, her anecdotes polished, her insults subtle but sharp. She spoke of charity galas and European vacations, each story a brick in the wall separating her from people like Clara. Clara just nodded and smiled, a ghost at the feast, her presence acknowledged only when Laura needed a target for a backhanded compliment about her simple, rustic charm. Finally, as dessert was served, a confection of spun sugar and gold leaf that looked too beautiful and too fragile to eat. Clara knew it was now or never. Her palms were slick with sweat. Her throat was dry. This was the moment she had rehearsed in the mirror for weeks, the moment she would ask for a small seed of faith from the family she had tried so desperately to join. She cleared her throat. The sound was small, a mouse squeaking in a room full of lions. "Laura? Ethan? I was actually hoping to talk to you both about something." Laura paused, a tiny spoon halfway to her lips. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, does it have a point, Clara? The port is being served soon, and I'd hate for you to delay it with one of your little stories." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of something, pity, irritation, in his eyes. Mum let her speak. It was a weak defense, and they all knew it. Clara took a shaky breath and placed the portfolio on the pristine white tablecloth. It looked like a child's drawing left on an altar. "It's a business plan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For a bakery, an artisanal bakery. I've done all the research, the cost analysis, the marketing projections. I need a small loan to get started, to secure a lease and buy the initial equipment." Silence descended upon the table. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Then it happened. A sound Clara would never forget. Laura laughed. It wasn't a chuckle or a giggle, it was a sharp, percussive bark of genuine cruel amusement. It echoed off the high ceilings, a sound that stripped Clara bare, leaving her exposed and humiliated. "A bakery?" Laura repeated, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. "Oh, Clara, you are just priceless. A little baker girl. How quaint. You want our money, the money my family built, through intelligence and ruthless strategy, to play with flour and yeast." "It's not playing," Clara whispered, her face burning with shame. "It's a viable business. People appreciate quality, handmade goods." "People like you, perhaps," Laura sneered, her smile gone, replaced by a cold mask of contempt. "Let me be clear. You will not embarrass this family with your pathetic little dream. You will not attach our name to some charity project for the middle class. You are a Henderson now, for better or worse. Start acting like it. Get a respectable job, or better yet, focus on what you were meant to do. Host my son's dinner parties and look pretty." Clara looked to Ethan, her eyes pleading for him to intervene, to defend her, to show an ounce of loyalty. He just stared down at his plate, his jaw tight. The silence from her husband was louder and more painful than his mother's insults. It was a confirmation of his allegiance. "This is why I told you not to bring it up," Ethan finally mumbled, not looking at her. "It's a bad idea, Clara. Mum's right. Just drop it." He reached into his wallet, pulled out 3 $100 bills, and tossed them onto the table. They fluttered down next to her portfolio. "Here," he said, his voice flat and cold, "for your little hobby. Go buy yourself a new mixer, but do not ever bring this up again. You're embarrassing us." The world went quiet. The air solidified around Clara, pressing in on her until she couldn't breathe. The money on the table was not a gift. It was a dismissal. It was a price tag for her silence, for the death of her dream. She felt something inside her shatter, a final, fragile piece of hope turning to dust. She stood up, her chair scraping against the marble floor. She didn't take the money. She didn't take her portfolio. She left it all there on the table, a monument to her humiliation. She walked out of the dining room, through the cavernous foyer, and out the heavy oak doors into the cold night air. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked, the sound of Laura's laughter still ringing in her ears. A moment later, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Annoyed, she pulled it out, expecting a perfunctory, guilt-ridden text from Ethan. But it was an unknown number. The message was short, just a few words that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Don't give up. Help is coming. Your dream is valid." Clara stared at the screen, bewildered. She assumed it was a wrong number, a random text sent into the ether. But as she stood there, shivering in the cold, the cruel words of her family warring with the simple kindness of a stranger, she saved the number. It was a tiny, illogical act of defiance, a seed of mystery planted in the barren soil of her despair. The divorce was swift and cold, a legal transaction that mirrored the emotional emptiness of her marriage. Ethan, guided by his mother's lawyers, was ruthlessly efficient. Clara was left with a small settlement, just enough to rent a tiny apartment on the other side of town, a world away from the gated communities and manicured lawns she had briefly inhabited. The life she had tried to build was dismantled, packed into boxes, and stored away like a forgotten memory. She spent the first few months in a fog of grief and failure. The memory of that final dinner played on a loop in her mind. Laura's mocking laughter, Ethan's cold dismissal, the $300 bills lying on the table like an insult. The portfolio with her dreams and projections had been thrown away, she was sure, a piece of trash in a house that tolerated no imperfections. Her confidence was shattered, her spirit bruised. Baking, the one thing that had brought her joy, now felt tainted, a reminder of what she had lost. But the text message from the unknown number remained on her phone. She would read it late at night when the loneliness was most acute. "Your dream is valid." It was a simple, declarative statement, a stark contrast to the complex web of passive aggression and conditional love she had known. It became a lifeline, a whisper of encouragement in the overwhelming silence. Who had sent it? Why? She had no answers, but the mystery itself was a distraction from her pain. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece her life back together. She found a part-time job at a local coffee shop, the smell of roasting beans and steamed milk a comforting balm. She started baking again, just for herself at first. Small batches of cookies, a simple loaf of sourdough. The familiar rhythm of kneading dough, the science of yeast and heat, began to heal something deep inside her. It was a process she could control, a creation that was entirely her own. Her small apartment kitchen became her sanctuary. She experimented with recipes, pouring all her frustration and hope into her craft. Her co-workers at the coffee shop became her first customers, eagerly buying the pastries she brought in each morning. Their genuine praise was like water on parched earth. It wasn't the condescending approval of the wealthy. It was the simple, honest appreciation of people who recognized quality and passion. The dream she had nearly abandoned began to stir again. One evening, fueled by a surge of defiance, she sat down at her small kitchen table and rewrote her business plan from memory. This time, there was no hesitation, no apology in her words. It was bolder, more ambitious. She called it The Humble Crust, a name that was both a nod to her craft and a quiet rebellion against the arrogant world she had escaped. With her new plan in hand, she walked into a downtown bank, her heart pounding with a familiar mix of hope and dread. She expected rejection. She was prepared for it. She was a divorced woman with a minimal credit history and a dream that had already been laughed out of a mansion. She presented her plan to a loan officer, a kind-faced man named Mr. Peterson. He listened patiently, studied her projections, and told her he would be in touch. A week later, the bank called. Clara's hands trembled as she answered. She braced herself for the gentle letdown. Instead, Mr. Peterson's voice was warm and enthusiastic. "Miss Vance," he said, using her maiden name, a name she was still getting used to again. "The loan committee has reviewed your application. We are pleased to inform you that your loan has been approved." Clara sank into a chair, speechless. "Approved?" she finally managed to whisper. "Not just approved," he continued. "We were so impressed with the plan's potential that we've approved you for double the amount you requested. The terms are also, well, they're exceptionally favorable. Frankly, I've never seen anything like it for a startup." Clara was stunned. "But how? My financials, they're not that strong." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Let's just say an anonymous investor with the bank has taken a special interest in supporting local entrepreneurs," Mr. Peterson said, his voice carefully neutral. "They've set up a fund to guarantee loans for promising new businesses. Your plan was selected." "Congratulations, Miss Vance. Someone out there clearly believes in you." "Someone believes in you," the words echoed the mysterious text message. A coincidence? Or was this the help that had been promised? Overwhelmed with gratitude and disbelief, Clara didn't press for details. The door to her dream had been flung wide open, and she was not going to question the miracle. She was going to run through it. Meanwhile, across town, life continued unchanged for Laura and Ethan. They heard through the society grapevine that Clara had opened a small bakery. The news was met with derision. The humble crust, Laura scoffed to her friends over lunch at the country club. How fittingly dreary. I give it 6 months before she's begging Ethan for alimony. Ethan, who was now dating a woman his mother had handpicked, an heiress with a vacant smile and a portfolio of family stocks, agreed. "It's a folly," he said with an air of authority. "She has no head for business. She's emotional, not strategic." It was a line he had heard his mother use 1,000 times, and now he repeated it as his own. They were both secure in their judgment, cocooned in the certainty that wealth and status were a direct result of innate superiority. Clara's failure was, in their minds, a foregone conclusion. They gave it no further thought, turning their attention back to more important matters like planning their next trip to Monaco. They were completely unaware of the silent, powerful forces moving just beneath the surface of their gilded world. The first few years were a blur of relentless work. Clara poured every ounce of her being, every dollar of the mysterious loan, into the humble crust. She was the first to arrive each morning, long before the sun rose, and the last to leave, her clothes dusted with flour and her body aching with exhaustion. But it was a good ache, the ache of creation, of building something tangible from nothing. The small bakery, with its warm lighting and the intoxicating smell of fresh bread, became an extension of herself. Her dedication paid off. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. People were drawn not just to the quality of her products, the perfectly flaky croissants, the rustic sourdough with its chewy crumb, the delicate pastries that were both art and food, but to the atmosphere of the place. It was welcoming, unpretentious, a haven from the cold, commercialized world outside. It was everything Laura's world was not. The humble crust didn't just survive, it thrived. Within 2 years, Clara had paid back the loan in full, decades ahead of schedule. She opened a second location, then a third. Her small bakery grew into a beloved local chain of cafes, each one maintaining the core principles of quality, community, and kindness. She became a local celebrity, the subject of magazine articles and news segments. She was hailed as a self-made success story, an inspiration for aspiring entrepreneurs. Through it all, Clara remained grounded. She never forgot the sting of humiliation, the feeling of being small and worthless. It fueled her, not with bitterness, but with a fierce determination to create a business that was the antithesis of the values that had nearly crushed her. She paid her employees a living wage, offered them health insurance, and fostered a culture of respect and collaboration. Her success was a quiet, powerful rebuke to Laura and Ethan. Yet a question lingered in the back of her mind. The loan, the anonymous benefactor, the text message she had never deleted. It was a loose thread in the otherwise seamless tapestry of her new life. She had built this empire with her own hands, but she knew, with a certainty that never faded, that someone had unlocked the first door for her. Who was it, and why had they remained silent for all these years? One crisp autumn afternoon, 5 years after she had walked out of Laura's mansion, a letter arrived at her main office. It was delivered by a courier, enclosed in a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of a prestigious downtown law firm, Davies, Finch and Associates. Her name was written on the front in elegant calligraphy. With a sense of unease, she opened it. The letter was formal and brief. It requested her presence at their offices at her earliest convenience to discuss a matter of significant personal and financial importance. It was signed by a senior partner, Alistair Davies. A cold knot of anxiety formed in her stomach. Law firms meant trouble. Was Ethan suing her? Was Laura trying to claim some part of her success? She scheduled an appointment for the following week. The offices of Davies, Finch and Associates were exactly as she had imagined, a world of polished mahogany, hushed tones, and the faint, expensive smell of old leather and paper. She was led into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city skyline, a view that included the glittering tower that housed Ethan's investment firm. Alistair Davies rose to greet her. He was an older man with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanour that immediately put her at ease. "Miss Vance," he said, shaking her hand, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat. I represent a client who has been following your career with great admiration." Clara sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "A client?" "Yes," Mr. Davies said, settling into the chair behind his massive desk. "Someone you once knew. Someone who asked me to reach out now that your business is firmly established and your success is undeniable. He wanted to give you time to prove to yourself and to the world that you could do it on your own." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Clara, my client is Marcus Henderson." The name hit her like a physical blow. Marcus, her former father-in-law, Ethan's father. But that was impossible. "Marcus is dead," Clara said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Laura told me he passed away years ago, just after the divorce. A heart attack on a golf course." A sad smile touched Mr. Davies's lips. "Laura has always been gifted at crafting narratives to suit her needs. I assure you Marcus is very much alive. He is, however, no longer married to Laura. He divorced her shortly after you divorced Ethan. He found her behavior to be untenable." Clara's mind reeled. Marcus was alive. The quiet, gentle man who had always shown her kindness, who seemed as much a prisoner in Laura's house as she was alive. "He was there that night," Mr. Davies continued softly. "The night of the dinner party. He was in his study, but the doors were open. He heard everything. He heard Laura's cruelty, Ethan's cowardice, and your quiet dignity. It was, he told me, the final, unforgivable straw. It broke his heart to see you treated that way." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Someone had been a witness. Someone had cared. He wanted to help you, but he knew that any overt gesture would be rejected or, worse, used by Laura to control you further. So he decided to act in secret. He was the one who sent you the text message that night. From a burner phone, he was the anonymous benefactor who guaranteed your loan at the bank. He instructed me to set up a series of legal structures to support you without your knowledge. It was all clicking into place. The mysterious help, the impossible good fortune. It was Marcus. It had always been Marcus. "But there's more," Mr. Davies said, leaning forward. He slid a thick binder across the desk. "Marcus was a very shrewd man, far more so than Laura ever gave him credit for. Years ago, when he saw the kind of person his wife was becoming and the toxic influence she had on their son, he began to protect his assets. Not for himself, but for a future he hoped would be better. He set up a blind trust. On the day you married Ethan, he made you the sole beneficiary of that trust, to be activated in the event of your divorce." Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. "A trust? For me?" "A very, very substantial trust," Mr. Davies confirmed. "Your initial business loan was merely a drop in the ocean. Over the past 5 years, as per Marcus's instructions, I have been using the capital in that trust to make strategic investments on your behalf. We have acquired commercial real estate, controlling interests in financial institutions, a diverse portfolio of assets. Clara, you are not just a successful business owner, you are an exceptionally wealthy woman." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. She opened the binder. It was filled with deeds, stock certificates, and financial statements. The numbers were staggering, meaningless in their scale. Then her eyes landed on a specific address listed under commercial properties. Her breath caught in her throat. "That address," she said, her finger tracing the words.
That's the flagship location of Laura's, her luxury boutique. It's the centerpiece of her empire. Mr. Davies nodded grimly. Indeed. We acquired the entire commercial block 3 years ago through a shell corporation. For the past 36 months, Laura Henderson has been paying her rent, unknowingly, to you. The irony was so profound, so devastating, it was almost comical. The symbol of Laura's superiority, the temple she had built to her own vanity, was owned by the very woman she had dismissed as worthless. And there's one more thing, Mr. Davies said, his tone somber. He turned a page in the binder, revealing the details of a regional bank. This is the institution that holds the majority of the business loans for Henderson Investment Group, Ethan's firm, the company he had bragged about at that final dinner. As of last quarter, Mr. Davies stated, your trust acquired a controlling interest in that bank.
Which means, Clara, that your ex-husband's entire enterprise is leveraged with debt that you now effectively control. Clara closed the binder. The weight of it felt immense. This wasn't just money, it was power, a terrifying, absolute power over the two people who had tried to destroy her. She looked out the window at the city, at the glittering tower where Ethan was likely sitting, arrogant and oblivious. She thought of Laura preening in her boutique, surrounded by luxury paid for, with rent checks that ended up in Clara's account. Marcus had not just given her a helping hand, he had given her a sword. Mr. Davies's voice cut through her thoughts. Marcus has now signed over full and direct control of the trust and all its assets to you. He is retiring to a quiet life abroad. He said to tell you this. It's your life, your victory.
You decide what happens next. Clara spent the next 48 hours in a daze, locked in her apartment with the binder that contained the blueprint of her new reality. She didn't sleep, she barely ate. She just read, poring over the legal documents, the financial statements, the dizzying evidence of a life she never knew she was living. Her success with the humble crust felt small in comparison, a quaint prologue to this shocking new chapter. The knowledge of her power was a heavy weight. One part of her, the part that had cultivated kindness and community, was horrified. The ability to ruin two people, to dismantle their lives with a few phone calls, felt like a dark and terrible magic. It was the kind of power Laura had always craved, the power to dominate and control. To use it would be to become like her, wouldn't it? But another part of her, a colder, more pragmatic part that had been forged in the fire of humiliation, felt a different emotion.
It was a quiet, humming sense of vindication. She thought of that night, of the laughter, of the money thrown on the table. She remembered years of biting her tongue, of shrinking herself to fit into their world, of feeling like she was never, ever good enough. They had shown her no mercy. They had delighted in her perceived weakness. Why should she show them mercy now? This wasn't about revenge, she told herself. It was about balance. It was about justice. They had built their world on a foundation of arrogance and cruelty. She would simply be the earthquake that revealed how unstable that foundation truly was. They had wielded their power like a weapon to hurt her. She would wield hers like a scalpel to excise a cancer. On the third morning, she woke with a sense of cold, resolute clarity. The internal debate was over. She showered, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, and called Mr. Davies. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice steady and calm, devoid of the emotion that had churned inside her for days. "I am at your service, Miss Vance," he replied. "I want to schedule a strategy session. Today, we need a plan, a precise, surgical plan. I want to use every legal tool at our disposal. Their own arrogance will be the mechanism of their downfall, We will not be cruel. We will simply enforce the terms of their agreements. They met that afternoon in the law firm's conference room. For hours they worked, mapping out a multi-pronged attack that was both legally impenetrable and psychologically devastating. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Phase 1 would target Laura. Mr. Davies had found several clauses in the boutique's commercial lease, clauses Laura's high-priced but lazy lawyers had clearly never read, that allowed the property owner to retroactively adjust the rent based on the commercial block's dramatically increased property value. They would draft a notice demanding several $1 million in back rent, effective immediately. The new monthly lease payment would be quintupled. "She will never be able to pay it," Mr. Davies noted. "I know," Clara said calmly, "but her pride will not allow her to walk away. She will liquidate her other assets to try. She will drain her fortune fighting for a symbol." Phase 2 would target Ethan. The bank, now under the influence of its new majority ownership, would conduct a full risk assessment of its major commercial loans. Ethan's firm, over-leveraged and built on risky, speculative ventures, would be flagged immediately. The bank would exercise its right to recall his loans, demanding immediate repayment of tens of millions of dollars. "He will panic," Clara predicted. "He will try to secure financing elsewhere, make sure the other financial institutions are aware of his firm's instability. We won't slander him. We will simply share the truth of his financial situation.
No one will touch him." The nature of the plan was clear. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a controlled demolition. Clara would not be the visible force of destruction. She would be the invisible hand guiding the market, the quiet administrator of consequences. They had written the rules of their own game, a game of high-stakes finance and cutthroat business. She would simply play it better than they ever had. At the end of the meeting, Mr. Davies slid 2 documents across the table. One was the official rent adjustment notice for Laura's boutique. The other was the directive to the bank's board to initiate the loan recall for Henderson Investment Group. All they needed was her signature. Clara picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen. For a moment, she hesitated. The image of Ethan's face, not as the cold man at the dinner table, but as the younger man she had once loved, flashed in her mind. A pang of something, a ghost of an old affection, made her pause.
Then, just as quickly, she remembered his silence, his complicity, his choice to stand with his mother and watch her dream be crushed. He had made his bed. It was time for him to lie in it. She signed both documents with a firm, steady hand. The first dominoes had been pushed. The cascade had begun. She stood up, shook Mr. Davies's hand, and walked out of the law office, leaving the machinery of justice to do its work. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, she felt not triumph, but a profound and chilling sense of peace. The storm was coming for the Hendersons, and she was the quiet eye at its center. The first sign of the storm arrived in a crisp, legally mandated envelope delivered by a stern-faced courier to Laura's boutique. Laura, who was in the middle of berating a sales assistant for improperly steaming a silk blouse, accepted the envelope with an annoyed sigh. She assumed it was a tedious matter from one of her suppliers. She slit it open with a silver letter opener, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with impatience. Then she stopped. Her perfectly made-up face went slack, the color draining from her cheeks. She read the first paragraph again, then a third time. It had to be a mistake, a typo, a joke. Millions in back rent? A 500% increase in her monthly lease? It was absurd. It was impossible. She let out a strangled cry of outrage. "A mistake!" she shrieked into the phone at her lawyer minutes later. "This is harassment! Sue them! Sue this ridiculous shell corporation! Find out who they are and destroy them!" Her lawyer, a man well paid to be calm, promised to look into it, but his tone was laced with a professional concern that only fueled her panic. Simultaneously, across the city, a similar scene of disbelief was unfolding in Ethan's glass-walled office. The thick packet from the bank sat on his desk like an unexploded bomb. A loan recall, all of them, effective immediately. His entire business was built on that capital. Without it, he was insolvent. He was nothing. His first reaction was denial. He called his contact at the bank, a man he played golf with, a man who had always been pliable. But the man's voice was distant, formal. "I'm sorry, Ethan. It's out of my hands. The new board is being extremely aggressive on risk management. It's a portfolio-wide directive." Disbelief quickly curdled into panic. Ethan spent the next 72 hours in a frantic state of damage control. He called every financial contact he had, trying to secure a new line of credit to cover the recall. Doors that had always been open were suddenly, inexplicably, slammed in his face. Whispers had already started to circulate on the financial grapevine. Henderson Investment Group was toxic, unstable, a sinking ship. Laura's panic was louder, more theatrical. Her lawyer called back with grim news. The lease was ironclad. The new owners were well within their legal rights. Her only options were to pay the astronomical sum or face eviction and a lawsuit that would bankrupt her. Consumed by a furious pride, she refused to consider closing the boutique. It was the monument to her social standing. To lose it would be to admit defeat. She began the painful process of liquidating her personal stocks and selling off art and jewelry, pouring her fortune into a black hole to save face. The cascade effect was swift and brutal. Within 2 weeks, the first official eviction notice was pasted on the gleaming front door of Laura's. A photographer from the city's business journal snapped a picture, and the next morning the story was on the front page of the business section. Luxury retail empress faces eviction amidst lease dispute. The story was couched in neutral terms, but the subtext was clear. The Henderson empire was cracking. Laura's phone, which usually rang with invitations from her circle of socialites, fell silent. Friends crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers at the country club grew louder. She was no longer a queen to be feared and respected. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale. For Ethan, the collapse was just as rapid, but far more complex. His investors, catching wind of the loan recall, started pulling their money out in a panic. His firm imploded. He was facing not just bankruptcy, but potential investigations from financial regulators for the risky, borderline fraudulent practices he had employed to maintain the illusion of success. His credit cards were declined. The life of effortless luxury he had always known evaporated like a mirage. Throughout this period, Clara observed the collapse from a serene distance. She read the articles in the paper, her morning coffee in hand, in the quiet of her sun-filled apartment. She felt a detached, almost clinical sense of satisfaction. There was no joy, no gloating. It was simply the logical conclusion of a long overdue equation. She continued to run her business, exuding an aura of calm focus. Her employees saw only their dedicated, kind-hearted boss. Her customers saw only the warm and welcoming spaces she had created. No one could have guessed that she was the architect of the storm that was laying waste to one of the city's most prominent families. The dramatic irony was a secret she kept locked away, a cold, hard stone in the pit of her stomach. One afternoon, Ethan showed up at her main office, unannounced. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes were wild with desperation. He bypassed the front desk and burst into her office. Clara, you have to help me, he pleaded, his voice cracking. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. I'm ruined. Everything is gone. Mum is... She's a mess. I need a loan, just a short-term loan to stop the bleeding. Clara looked at him, the man who had thrown money at her to silence her dream. The man who was now begging her for money to save his. She felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of his coldness. I'm sorry, Ethan, she said, her voice even and calm. My company's funds are all allocated. I can't help you. She maintained the facade of concerned sympathy, a mask of polite regret. It was a perfect, chilling performance. He stared at her, his mind unable to process the refusal. But sure, you're successful. Everyone says so. A small loan would be nothing to you for old times' sake. The old times are precisely why I can't help you, Ethan, she said softly. I'm sorry for your troubles. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run. He left, defeated and bewildered, utterly oblivious to the fact that he had just begged for salvation from his own executioner. Clara watched him go, feeling nothing but the quiet finality of a chapter closing. The Hendersons were broken, but the reckoning was not yet complete. The final act was still to come. The invitation arrived a week later. Clara had just been named the city's Entrepreneur of the Year, a prestigious award that cemented her status as a titan of local business. The city's most popular morning talk show, City Sunrise, invited her for an exclusive live interview to discuss her incredible journey. At first, she was hesitant to accept. She had always shied away from the spotlight, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But then she realized what this was. It was a stage, a national stage. It was the perfect setting for the final public reveal. It was an opportunity not just to tell her story, but to control the narrative, to expose the truth in a way that could never be denied or spun. She accepted. The morning of the interview, she chose her outfit with care, a simple, elegant navy blue dress. It was professional, understated and powerful. It was the armor of a woman who was comfortable in her own skin, who needed no diamonds or designer labels to broadcast her worth. The television studio was a flurry of controlled chaos. Technicians adjusted lights, producers whispered into headsets, and the host, a charismatic woman named Sharon, went over the pre-interview questions with her. Clara felt surprisingly calm. The anxiety that had once defined her was gone, replaced by an unshakable sense of purpose. The live broadcast began. Sharon introduced Clara with effusive praise, recounting the meteoric rise of the humble crust. They talked about business philosophy, the importance of ethical practices, and her commitment to her employees. Clara answered every question with grace and intelligence. She was poised, articulate, and inspiring. Then Sharon leaned in, her expression turning more personal. Clara, your story is so incredible, a true from-the-ground-up success. But I have to ask, what was the moment?
What was the spark that gave you the courage to take that first leap, to believe in yourself when maybe others didn't? This was the moment. Clara looked away from Sharon and directly into the lens of the main camera, as if she was speaking to every person watching in their living rooms. Courage often comes from having no other choice, she began, her voice clear and steady. My journey didn't start with a spark of inspiration. It started with a moment of profound humiliation. It started at a family dinner where I presented my business plan to my then husband and his mother. A hush fell over the studio. This was not in the pre-approved notes. My dream, Clara continued, her gaze unwavering, was laughed at. I was told I was embarrassing my new family. I was told to give up my pathetic little dream and focus on being a proper wife.
My husband, the man who was supposed to be my partner, threw a few $100s on the table and told me to buy myself a new mixer for my hobby. The air in the studio was electric. The producers in the control room were frantically signaling, but Sharon, sensing a powerful moment, waved them off. I walked out of that house with nothing but the clothes on my back and a fire in my soul. I built my success on my own 2 hands, with a belief in my dream and the goal of creating a business that was the opposite of the world I had left behind, a world built on cruelty, arrogance, and the idea that money makes you better than other people. What my former family never understood is that real power isn't about humiliating others, it's about resilience. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the side of the stage, shouts, a scuffle with security, and then, bursting past the guards and into the bright lights of the set, were Laura and Ethan. They looked like ghosts from her past, pale, disheveled, and consumed by a desperate rage. "Lies!" Laura shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. Her hair was a mess, her designer suit stained. She pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "She's lying! She did this to us! She planned this all along! She was always a vindictive little snake, just waiting for her moment to strike." The cameras swung to capture the chaos. Ethan, his face a mask of broken despair, tried to pull his mother back. "Mum, stop! Please, we can't do this here." But Laura was beyond reason. She was a cornered animal, a lashing out. "You ruined us!" she screamed at Clara, her breakdown being broadcast live to the entire city. "You took everything from us!" Clara didn't flinch. She remained perfectly still, a calm island in the hurricane of Laura's fury. She let the tirade continue for a few moments, letting the world see the raw, ugly truth of the woman who had tormented her. Then she slowly rose to her feet. She turned not to Laura, but back to the camera. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise with chilling precision. "She says I took everything from them," Clara said. "But what she doesn't know, what she was too arrogant to ever investigate, is that for the last 5 years she's been paying her boutique's rent to me. The very building she used as a throne to look down on people was an asset in a trust set up for my benefit." Laura froze, her mouth hanging open. Ethan stared at Clara, a look of dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. "Her son's investment firm," Clara continued, her gaze as cold and hard as steel, "was funded by a bank that I now effectively control. The recall of his loans wasn't a market fluctuation, it was a business decision. My business decision. They didn't just underestimate me, they underestimated decency and the quiet, patient consequences of their own actions. I didn't ruin them.
I simply held up a mirror and they shattered." Security guards finally managed to restrain a now sobbing Laura and a catatonic Ethan, escorting them off the set. The studio was plunged into a stunned silence. Clara, poised and powerful, stood alone in the spotlight. She had not raised her voice, she had not shed a tear, she had simply spoken the truth. The reckoning was complete. She had won. The aftermath of the live television confrontation was a firestorm. The clip of Laura's meltdown and Clara's devastatingly calm reveal went viral. It was played on every news channel, dissected on social media, and discussed in every corner of the city. The Hendersons were no longer just a failing dynasty. They were a public spectacle, their downfall a modern-day morality play for the entire world to witness. Their ruin was total and absolute. Laura became a social pariah overnight. The few friends who hadn't already abandoned her now treated her like a leper.
Bankrupt and publicly shamed, she was forced to sell what little she had left. The sprawling mansion where she had once held court was sold at auction. She and Ethan ended up in a small, cramped rental apartment in a rundown part of the city, a cruel, ironic echo of the life of simple, rustic charm they had once so viciously mocked. Ethan's legal troubles mounted, the collapse of his firm triggered multiple investigations, and he was soon buried under an avalanche of lawsuits from furious investors. He lost everything: his money, his reputation, and the last vestiges of his self-respect. He was a broken man, haunted by the ghost of the wife he had betrayed and the father he had disappointed. Clara, however, retreated from the spotlight as quickly as she had entered it. She gave no more interviews, issued no statements. She had said everything that needed to be said. The immense wealth and power that were now hers were not tools for gloating, but instruments for change. She sold the commercial block that had housed Laura's boutique and the controlling interest in the bank, liquidating the assets that were tied to her painful past. With the vast fortune now at her disposal, she established the Humble Crust Foundation, a non-profit organization with a singular, powerful mission to provide microloans, mentorship, and business training to women from disadvantaged backgrounds who had a dream but lacked the resources to pursue it. She wanted to be the benefactor she had needed, to offer a hand up to those who had been pushed down. The foundation became her new passion, her life's work. She found a deeper joy in empowering others than she ever had in her own commercial success. Her own life found a new, peaceful rhythm. Despite her wealth, she continued to live modestly. She bought a small house with a large garden where she grew her own herbs and vegetables. She remained the CEO of the Humble Crust, but she was never happier than when she was visiting one of her cafes, an apron tied around her waist, her hands dusted with flour, teaching a new generation of bakers the craft that had saved her life. One afternoon, while reviewing architectural plans for a new training center for her foundation, she met a man named David. He was the architect, a kind, thoughtful man with a warm smile and eyes that saw beyond her fame and fortune. He was captivated not by the Entrepreneur of the Year, but by the passionate woman who spoke about giving people a second chance. They talked for hours about building things that last, about blueprints for buildings and for lives. A new, healthy love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values, began to quietly bloom. The final scene of her old life played out not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in the simple, everyday reality of her new one. She was in one of her cafes, laughing as she showed a young, nervous apprentice how to properly knead sourdough. The sun streamed through the large front window, illuminating the motes of flour dancing in the air. She was surrounded by the scent of baking bread, the sound of happy customers, and the feeling of a life built not on what was taken from her, but on what she had chosen to create. She had learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or luxury brands, but in resilience, in kindness, and in the quiet strength it takes to build a new world from the ashes of a cruel one. True power, she now knew with absolute certainty, lay not in the cold, satisfying act of tearing others down, but in the warm, endless grace of lifting them up.